Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 30th of September. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 219 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition, and then I'll take a quick look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Then I'll introduce this evening's guest, and together we will discuss the latest developments from Ukraine, the paper recently published by The Bottom Line, and then the current economic crisis that is engulfing Brexit Island. Vladimir Putin has signed accession treaties formalising Russia's illegal annexation of 4 occupied territories in Ukraine, marking the largest forcible takeover of territory in Europe since the Second World War. A civilian convoy of cars heading to pick up relatives trying to flee Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine has been hit by Russian forces near the city of Zaporizhia, with initial reports saying that at least 25 people were killed and 50 people were injured. According to locals, 60 cars had gathered on a road in 2 lines after registering for a convoy that was due to take people into the Russian-occupied territories in the south, planning to bring relatives to Ukrainian government-occupied territory for fear that Russia will prevent people from leaving. In the hours before the attack, Russia had launched strikes on several cities, including the centre of the nearby city of Dnipro. A large number of Russian forces in the strategic Donbass town of Liman were reported to have been encircled in the latest setback in the battlefield for Russia. A Russian-installed official in the southern Kherson region of Ukraine has been killed in a Ukrainian missile strike, according to Russian state media. Ukrainian forces have secured all of Kupiansk and driven Russian troops from their remaining positions on the east bank of the river that divides the northeastern Ukrainian city. The so-called People's Militia of the Donetsk People's Republic has stated that the first Russian troops from the partial mobilization have arrived in Donetsk and are undergoing training. Gas is likely to stop leaking from the damaged Nord Stream 1 pipeline on Monday, according to the pipeline's operator. A spokesperson for Nord Stream AG said it was not possible to provide any forecasts for the pipeline's future operation until the damage had been assessed. Finland is closing its border to Russian tourists after Putin's partial mobilization order prompted large numbers of people to flee the country. And Russia is escalating its use of Iranian-supplied kamikaze drones in southern Ukraine, including against the southern port of Odessa and the nearby city of Mykolaiv. And Oleg Deripaska, one of Russia's most powerful oligarchs, has now been indicted by the US Department of Justice for criminal sanctions violations. Deripaska previously had deep links to the British establishment figures. Thousands of school pupils from across Scotland have taken part in a national school assembly with the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to mark the end of Climate Week. They discussed the action young people are already taking to build a sustainable future and what pupils have learnt about climate change, including what measures they can take to secure a greener planet for us all. Scotland's Climate Week encourages everyone to talk about the climate, as everyone has a role to play in creating a net zero Scotland. The First Minister visited St Albert's Primary School in Pollokshields to take part and hear about their daily live lessons on climate-related topics. Arab ambassadors in London are urging Liz Truss not to go ahead with an illegal and ill-judged plan to move the British Embassy to Jerusalem. Some Arab diplomats have even said the plan could jeopardise talks on a highly prized free trade deal between the UK and the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is due to be completed this year. Hundreds of child asylum seekers are at risk of abuse and neglect due to the Home Office wrongly classifying them as adults, according to 2 new reports from the Refugee Council and Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit published today. The reports highlight concerns about the way the Home Office is treating young people upon arriving in the UK and finds that 75% of child asylum seekers who are misclassified as adults by the Home Office have their age assessments overturned on appeal. Thousands of people living lawfully in the UK are encountering delays in the visa renewal process, which then causes them problems with hostile environment policies, according to research published this week by a migrants' rights charity. People granted the 3C leave status while they wait for the Home Office to process their applications have their right to work, rent property, and access healthcare protected in theory. However, as they have documentary evidence to prove their status, many face difficulties with landlords and employers. Fears that the Iranian regime may attempt a bloody repression of the kind that led to as many as 1,500 deaths after protests in 2019 have been raised by a group of eminent British lawyers asked to investigate what happened 3 years ago. And the latest national survey has estimated that there are now only 542 individual capercaillie in Scotland. This is a reduction of around 50% from the previous survey, putting the population at real risk of extinction. Conservation scientists have identified that capercaillie decline is being fueled by a combination of factors which reduce their survival and breeding success. This survey was conducted over the winter of 2021-22. It was funded by RSPB Scotland, Nature Scot, the Cairngorms National Park Authority, the Cairngorms Capercaillie Project, Forestry and Land Scotland, and Scottish Forestry, with RSPB Scotland undertaking the fieldwork and scientific analysis of the results. Now, we are very lucky to be joined this evening by Roger Mullin, who is, of course, a former SNP MP and a former chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Explosive Weapons. Roger has over 30 years' experience in leading research and consultancy companies. He is an honorary professor of the University of Stirling Management School, and before entering Parliament, he undertook 27 international assignments for UN agencies, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. Since leaving the Parliament in 2017, he has been the founding director of Momentous Change Limited and is also a founder of The Bottom Line, a new organisation that is working to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of the Scottish economy and how to improve what it delivers for the people who live in Scotland. Roger, good evening. How are you keeping?
Good evening. Yes, I'm well and pleased to see you again, Andrew.
Well, we're delighted that you've been able to join us this evening on the Scotland at 7, Roger. It's great to see you. Now, firstly, this evening, Vladimir Putin has signed accession treaties formalizing Russia's illegal annexation of 4 occupied regions in Ukraine, making the largest forcible takeover of territory in Europe since the Second World War. The signing ceremony, held in defiance of international law, took place in the Grand Kremlin Palace in the presence of the country's political elites and comes on the heels of Kremlin-orchestrated fake referendums in the 4 Ukrainian regions: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Ukraine and its Western allies have said that they would never recognise Russia's claims on Ukraine's territory, while the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said on Thursday evening that the annexation has no legal value and deserves to be condemned. Today, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, said that Russia's illegal annexation proclaimed by Putin won't change anything. Putin's decision to sign treaties annexing the territories, some of which Russia does not fully control, is a major escalation of Russia's 7-month-old illegal war and is likely to shut the door on diplomacy for years to come. Taken together, Russia is annexing at least 40,000 square miles of eastern and southern Ukraine, about 15% of Ukraine's total area. So, Roger, where does today's extravaganza in Moscow take the people of Ukraine? Those people in Ukraine who live in the areas which Russia has annexed, and also those who live in the remainder of the country?
Well, of course, the people who are living in the areas that Russia claims it is annexing are going to have a government in terms of Russia determining what they can do, everything from the law to what they're able to teach in schools and the like are going to be enforced upon them. As you rightly said, Andrew, the referendums that were held were a complete sham. Some people were being forced to vote at the point of a gun, and you were only allowed really to vote one way. So there isn't any credible international body that I'm aware of have said that they would recognise these votes having any validity. And the problem for the people of Ukraine living within those areas is that they're going to be ruled and controlled at the point of a gun and with the imposition of Russian law. And so I would have thought what it will do is harden the resolve of the people in the other areas of Ukraine to try and, as it were, come to the rescue of the whole of Ukraine and to be resolute in the way in which they are prosecuting this a war, this illegal war, as you put it. Excuse me. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, because Putin seems to be using this to say, because I have declared they are part of Russia, it means I will bring all the resources of Russia to bear to defend against the others that are involved in this conflict. And of course, as we know, he's threatened about the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons and the like. So it's a move on his part that is allowing him to do even more aggressive saber rattling. But I don't detect at all that the Ukrainian people are daunted by this.
That's a very good point, Roger. I was going to ask you, what do you think that this annexation means for the West and for its relations with Moscow over the next few years?
Well, in any conflict, it's very difficult to say what's going to happen in a year's time or 2 years' time. But I think at the current time, what it's going to do is harden the resolve of the West. I believe that there's, since the announcement of further sanctions that are being placed on Russia and further promises of military aid. So if he thought it was going to deter other people, it's had precisely the reverse effect. So, and of course, he's beginning to have a bit of unrest because of the claim that he's going to mobilize a new 300,000 troops from within Russia. We can see that there's beginning to be outbursts of demonstrations against Putin, probably more severely than has happened to date.
Absolutely, Roger. Thank you. And finally, if and when the fighting stops, do you think that this move, the annexation, in the means by which the annexation has been carried out, been prosecuted, if and when the fighting stops, do you think that this annexation will make Russia stronger or weaker and even more isolated than it already is?
Well, I think all the evidence is that Putin thought this would be a few weeks and the whole of Ukraine would collapse and fall under his control. And he has utterly failed in that mission, as we know. And the longer this goes on, the longer they're suffering terrible losses in the battleground. And they're having to bring in untrained troops and the like, who in many cases will simply be cannon fodder. I mean, it's a desperate situation that people are having to face in any battle situation, but this seems to be even worse than normal. But he seems unconcerned about the number of Russians that are being killed in this. He seems determined somehow to hold on to his belief that he can win. Therefore, I can understand why some people are questioning what his mental state is right at the moment. He does seem to be interfering in military matters directly rather than leaving it to professional soldiers. And that is never a hopeful move.
Completely, Roger. Absolutely. In fact, in terms of what you're alluding to, I'm reminded that today's the anniversary of the 1938 Munich conference, when Britain and France agreed to Hitler's annexation of around 20% of Czechoslovakia. The annexed territory in that case lay along the German-Czech border, and Hitler had insisted that that area had historically been part of a greater Germany. So the history is speaking loud and clear to us today, I think. But let's move on.
Putin has sorry, I'm just going to finish by saying,
yes,
and Putin has never given up or moved back from some of his ambitions, not only for the whole of Ukraine, but in other parts, other countries that border on. So, yeah, so your analogy is a very apt one.
History is telling us if we have to listen to history again as usual. But let's move on to our next item this evening, because a new paper written for The Bottom Line, their website is thebottomline.scot, by Professor David Simpson, tells the story of a successful business that few know about, the water industry in Scotland. It is a case study of what is possible if you have agency. The water industry in Scotland has flourished in comparison with its counterparts south of the border. Over the last 20 years, the water industry in Scotland has improved efficiency, reduced operating costs, reduced bills for households, delivered significant investment in infrastructure, improved levels of service, and has delivered environmental benefits. This has been achieved by entrepreneurial leadership in a public-owned monopoly, something that the orthodoxy of UK government economic policy would not recognise as even possible. The experience of the Scottish water industry in the last 2 decades shows what can be achieved when there has been agency or responsibility in Scotland for decisions in every area of the industry: ownership, operational decision-making, and regulation. The outcome has been the development of an approach that fitted Scotland's political wishes, rather than the ideological preferences adopted somewhere else. The Bottom Line says this is a model which should be celebrated and one that can be replicated elsewhere in the Scottish economy. So, Roger, can you tell us perhaps a little more about what prompted the Bottom Line to produce this latest paper regarding the success of Scottish water?
Excuse me, yes. What we wanted to do was to find a good example of what we meant by agency, which was one of the earliest papers we published. And we also thought that, understandably, opposition parties continually raise what they think are critical examples of poor performance by the Scottish Government. So we thought there was scope for celebrating some of the successes rather more than there has been in the past. And the obvious example to take was the water sector. Now, why was it obvious? First of all, it is huge. It is one of the biggest sectors in the economy. It employs over 4,000 people. It supplies to every household in the land. It supplies to every business in the land. It supplies critical fresh water. It removes obviously household waste and other things. And people have got to the stage where I think most people take it for granted. We are not even in Scotland charged in the way in which they are in other countries by having a water meter. It just appears in your council tax bill. So people tend to be very unaware of the performance of this industry, which has got huge, valuable assets. So that's what drove us to want to have a paper on it. And since one of the other founders of the Bottom Line is Professor David Simpson, who himself was involved in Scottish water in the early years, for about the first 8 years or so, if memory serves me correctly, he was the ideal person to produce a paper. And I think his paper is well worth people reading. It is beautifully written. It explains what could be seen as a complex case study in a perfectly straightforward language, but language that is also very revealing of what has been accomplished and how it was accomplished.
That's tremendous. Thank you, Roger. And one thing that crossed my mind in thinking about the success, and as you say, thinking of the political context in which the Scottish Government operates and the current political debates, do you think that we will be able to protect what has been achieved by Scottish Water in the face of the threats that some say are presented by the Internal Market Act?
Yes, as it stands, I, I think we can hold the Internal Market Act at bay, in part because one of the successes of Scottish Water is dependent not just on ownership, not just on leadership, but we've got other components as well. So its major stakeholders are all within Scotland, whether it's environmental agencies or the like. And also, you pointed out yourself, Andrew, beginning something that's absolutely crucial. And that is, it's one of the few sectors where Scotland is in control of regulation from within Scotland. Now, I think all these things put together mean that we've got a very robust model that is going to be much more difficult for the UK to undertake any grab over, if I put it like that. So, but I mean, it's got lessons for elsewhere. I mean, a lot of what is done couldn't be directly replicated at the moment under devolution, because in some sectors, as we know, regulation, for example, is controlled from London and not from here. So you might be able to have some things taken into the public sector in Scotland, but they would still be dependent upon regulation set elsewhere. An obvious current example is the energy market.
Yes, of
And
course.
so,
Thank you.
and and so it's having all these things together that gives you what we call agency. Pulling all the parts together is important.
Absolutely, thank you, Roger. And certainly, we can make sure that the paper, which is on the bottom line website, that everyone can, as you say, can access it and can read it in order to get the full story and to understand everything that your colleague Professor Simpson has been writing. But let's move on now this evening to the main topic of our discussion. Now, my script for this evening says the UK economy in crisis. So, Roger, before we get into the detail, is the headline "The UK economy in crisis"? Is that headline fair and accurate? And if so, why?
I think it is very fair, and I think it is very accurate. Not just because of what people will have seen in the movement of the pound, for example, up and down like a yo-yo in the last few days, not just about what's being said in the television, but because of the long-run effect that it's going to have on things that will affect every man, woman, and child in the country. I mean, everything from, you know, for those people who are owning their home and got a mortgage, what's the impact going to be in mortgages? What's the impact going to be when you go shopping in terms of inflation? And so that I cannot imagine that there's a single person not going to be affected negatively, with the exception of those who earn vast sums of money. Everybody else is going to be affected negatively by this mini budget. It also is very odd in another way, and that is when it was being implemented. This is what you would call fiscal action, tax and spend action announced by the Chancellor. And normally what you want to have is you want to have this fiscal decision making in tune with central bank monetary policy. In other words, both going in roughly the same direction so that there's compatibility. What we had with this money budget is all of a sudden was the departure and heading in the opposite direction, the fiscal policy to monetary policy. And the only way in which that's been one of the consequences of that, of course, is subsequently the Bank of England have had to intervene in ways that it would not have wanted to have to intervene in the economy to try and get some stability into the marketplace.
Thanks, Roger. Now then, what we'll do is that there are a number of components to this story that I'd like to cover with you this evening. I'd like to look at the macroeconomics, look at the economic impact, as you've been discussing, the impact on all of us, and also at the politics of what is happening. Because the 25-minute statement that Kwasi Kwarteng gave on the 23rd of September, only a week ago, was meant to usher in an era of economic growth. Instead, it triggered a crisis. As investors took fright, gilt yields surged, prompting the Bank of England to say on Wednesday that it was ready to buy unlimited quantities of long-dated bonds in order to restore order to financial markets. Earlier, the pound had crashed to its lowest level ever against the US dollar. Although sterling has slightly rebounded, markets still imply a 40% chance that it will reach one-for-one parity with the dollar. The economic and political damage is immense. Mr. Kwarteng and Ms. Truss say that they want to boost Britain's anemic rate of growth. They could have set out policies to do so. Instead, only 3 weeks into the Truss premiership, their stated growth agenda may already have been damaged beyond repair. So, Roger, the first question for you this evening, just to give some context, it's something that's been spoken about a bit over the last few days. In case folks who are watching don't know what they are, could you possibly help us understand what a gilt is?
Well, I'll do my best. Gilts are like gold-plated guarantees from the government. And what they are is they are units of debt. So that if somebody listening has got a private pension or an occupational pension, pension fund managers will often buy gilts because they seem to be very secure, right? The value of them is seen to be very secure over long periods of time. So they're normally a component of things like pension funds, and they're often bought by people who are direct investors in other ways. But what you're doing in buying a gilt is you're effectively lending money that the government needs to borrow to pay for its actions. So the fact that the bank is having to buy lots of you, I don't know if you're going to go on to how gilts actually work, Andrew, but I mean, the fact that they're having to buy in colossal quantities, we're talking tens of billions of pounds, they're doing that in the hope that they can stabilize the marketplace rather than the cost of debt to the government rising and rising and rising in an uncontrolled way.
Thank you, Roger. No, we're not going to go into the detail of it. It was just a high level explanation because it's something that's been mentioned in just about every news broadcast this week in the UK, and it's not necessarily something that everybody would know what they were. However, by unveiling £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts alongside temporary measures to help with energy bills, Mr. Kwarteng succeeded in spooking financial markets in spectacular fashion. Most of the tax cuts and emergency spending had already been signalled, but the vaunted supply-side reforms needed to pay for them were vague, and the new government's approach to public finances was cavalier at best. Worse, the backdrop to Mr. Kwarteng's epic budget busting was a slump in bond markets that raised borrowing costs for even the most creditworthy governments. As investors took fright, gilt yields surged, prompting the Bank of England to say on September 28th that it was ready to buy unlimited quantities of long-dated bonds to restore order to financial markets. Earlier, the pound had crashed to its lowest level ever against the dollar, although sterling has since rebounded a little, although it was dropping again today earlier, and markets still imply a 40% chance that it will reach one-for-one parity with the US dollar. Comparisons between Britain and emerging markets swirled. The IMF slammed Mr. Kwarteng's plan, and after the worst start to a new administration in memory, people are already asking how long the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, may last. So, Roger, we've spoken about the impact on gilts and what gilts are, but why do you think the value of the pound has collapsed so spectacularly? And what is the effect of the drop in the pound? It has dropped against most currencies, even the ruble, but particularly against the US dollar.
Yes. Well, first of all, the value of any currency that is traded freely in the international marketplace it depends on the confidence the market places in it. And so when the mini budget was announced, it clearly shook the market. And by the market, I don't just mean the UK market. It shook the global marketplace that this action by the UK government seemed to be utterly insane. And therefore, they lost the confidence of others in the marketplace very quickly. And I'm not talking here of individuals, I'm talking of other states, other countries, other central banks and the like looked at this and were spooked. And as a result of that, who wants to hold sterling in those circumstances? Fewer than in the past, so the pound goes down and down and down. And then what happens, of course, is that this forced action from the UK government, because these things we talked of earlier, the gilts, the cost of debt, and of course, the Tories want to pay for their tax rises through debt, right? So that they're issuing the Bank of England had to intervene because the cost of debt in the marketplace was rising and rising and rising. I think even today, the cost of debt is something like 3 times effectively the kind of interest rate the government pays is about 3 times what it was a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago. And so it really has shaken the market. It's shaken the view that an advanced economy can behave in this way. I cannot think of a comparable example from an advanced economy, something like this happening before.
Thank you, Roger. Yes, I think we are in, as so often with the Tory government, recent Tory governments, we're in unprecedented times. Now, in terms of their policy agenda, Ms Truss and Mr Kwarteng say that they want to boost Britain's anemic rate of growth. So just to help us with that, why do you think that growth in the UK has recently been so low?
It's been so low for a long time. Part of the reason has been lack of investment. There's significantly more investment taking place in other advanced economies than has been taking place in the UK. So, and that is a contributor to poor productivity. And when you get poor productivity and your competitors have strong productivity, you're relatively falling further and further behind in the economic stakes, which is what has been happening. And we do not have as resilient an economy and as progressive as an economy as the unionists would have us believe. And so that this is actually not a short run thing. For decades, the UK has been performing poorly in this regard. Now, come to the question, is what the mini budget doing actually addressing some of the problems and actually addressing the issues that they claim to be addressing? Well, in my view, the answer is demonstrably no. It will do absolutely nothing to improve growth rates. So I don't know if you want to explore that in a little more detail, Andrew. I'm happy
Well,
to do so if you want.
I was going to yes, because the Chancellor had vaguely signalled what he wanted to do as supply side reforms, saying he wants to speed up infrastructure projects and house building and reform planning, at least in England and Wales. But if he's going to invest, if he says he wants to invest in infrastructure and house building, how is he now going to do that if inflation is driving the cost of those projects and house building through the roof, and the cost of borrowing to pay for the infrastructure is also rocketing?
Yes, well, he's not going to be able to afford. I mean, there's already been huge calls, as we've discussed, on the huge amount of debt they've had to take on to pay for tax cuts. My favourite example about the insanity of his approach was when he mentioned he wanted to sort the supply side as a reason for uncapping bankers' bonuses and as a reason for abolishing the 45% rate. He said what this would do is this would encourage people to come to the country and to work here and to help our economy. Now, why is that utterly bizarre? Well, first of all, you're talking of a handful of extraordinarily rich people who are going to be raking it in, right? They are not the people who are going to drive productivity in the economy. The second thing is, if you actually wanted to affect the real labour supply, what they would have done, well, first of all, they wouldn't be enthusiastic having left through Brexit. And they would certainly want to encourage economic immigration from all the key sectors of our economy. I mean, and that ranges from the service side, like the NHS needs to hire people from overseas, like private sector industries, like the energy sector, the manufacturing sector, the land sector, agriculture. They're all crying out to access people. They're doing nothing to sort that supply side problem, which in my view is far more critical for the real economy, than allowing bankers to rake in millions in bonuses.
Completely, Roger. Thank you. That's really helpful. Now, the one aspect of this that really struck me is that the fact that the budget, and we'll call it what it was a budget, it dodged independent scrutiny from the Office for Budget Responsibility, a key watchdog, and some say that was another signal of fiscal recklessness by the Chancellor. But to me, it struck me that this was planned recklessness. A Whitehall insider has suggested that the permanent secretary in the Treasury, Tom Scholar, could have kicked up a fuss about Kwarteng ploughing ahead with significant tax changes, despite the lack of any evidence around the cost, given that the Office for Budget Responsibility was prevented by Kwarteng from issuing a forecast. So instead, what Kwarteng did was summarily sack Tom Scholar, the most experienced senior civil servant in the Treasury. It looks a bit like we're avoiding having our homework marked, sighed one Tory MP. And to me, this is beginning to look a little bit like it was planned by Kwarteng and Trust. These exuberantly stupid things had named their policy Operation Rolling Thunder after the American offensive in the Vietnam War. Now, despite his history PhD, Kwarteng doesn't seem to understand what happened and how the Vietnam War worked out for the USA. But so if all of this even had a project name, is this a project that is spun out of control because it wasn't thought through, or was this crisis in the markets the intention all along?
I don't know that the crisis in the market, as it has wound along, was what they intended. But I certainly think they expected a reaction against their plans politically and economically from some quarters. And I'm absolutely sure they knew that they were going to get a negative reaction from the Bank of England because of their actions. Now, what it is that they've got this messianic belief in a very narrow view in which they want to see the economy, which they have tried to implement, and they've decided to go at it with great gusto. And they don't care, it would appear, they don't care about turmoil that may happen in the short run or even the medium term. What they seem to care about is imposing their view of the type of society and type of economy that they want in the future. And come hell and high water, they seem determined, or at least they seem determined at the moment, to pursue that. Now, I don't believe that they didn't expect some considerable turbulence. I would be surprised if they expected it to be as severe as it has been, though.
Thank you, Roger. That's a good reflection on the circumstances. Now, thinking on a little bit about the OBR, unusually this morning, both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor met the senior OBR team. After the meeting, the Treasury said that Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the Office for Budget Responsibility discussed the economic and fiscal outlook, as well as the process for growth forecasts. However, they said that the forecast, which they will receive on the 7th of October, won't be published until the 23rd of November. So in its first weeks, the new government has shredded its own reputation, unleashed higher inflation, forced emergency action from the central bank, and made growth harder. Just imagine what this government can do in a month or two. So the 23rd of November, why the unbelievable delay, do you think?
Well, it's difficult to provide a sensible explanation, I have to say. This time, I am slightly struggling here. But the best I can say is they must be living in sort of a cloud cuckoo land that thinks if we don't release what we know is going to be a fairly critical report from the Office of Budget Responsibility, if we don't release it that's going to be nearly 2 months
Mm-hmm.
before they release it. They must be hoping that something is going to happen in the interim that will allow them to say, you see, the OBR was wrong. It's not been as costly as they're predicting it would be. We don't have to unwind tax changes or anything else. That's the only explanation I can think. Although even at that, I don't think it's particularly plausible. I think it's more likely to be actually that what they're wanting to do is to avoid, although I think they're making a rod for their own back, is to avoid having to address some of the major political questions right now and some of the criticism. And they must think, for reasons that I'm baffled by, that this is not going to further harm the standing of the UK government in the markets. I can't see it'll do anything other than harm the standing of the UK government in the markets.
It's very much all pointing one way, Roger. You're absolutely right. But I'm sure we will come back to this. And actually, in a moment, we'll have a closer look at some of the politics of this. But to continue on the economics for a moment, the FT was reporting this afternoon that UK pension schemes are dumping stocks and bonds to raise cash and seeking bailouts from corporate backers as the crisis in their industry continues to rage a week after the government's budget. Most of the UK's 5,200 defined benefit pension schemes use derivatives to hedge against moves in interest rates and inflation, and that requires cash to be added depending on the way the market is moving. The sharp fall in the price of 30-year government bonds triggered by last week's tax cut announcement led to unprecedented demands for more cash. So to raise those funds, pension funds sold assets, including government bonds, causing prices to fall further. The Bank of England then stepped in to buy gilts on Wednesday, stabilising the market, but the pension funds are continuing to sell assets to meet cash calls. There's a lot of pain out there, a lot of forced selling, said Ariel Bezalel, a fund manager at Jupiter. People are having to sell what they can rather than what they would like to. So, Roger, with regard to pensions, what's happening here?
Well, what's happening is there has been such it's quite complicated, but if I put it as simply as I can, the way in which the pension funds have invested and used, as you rightly said, derivatives and other devices, right? The shock to the system of what the UK government has done has, I think Faisal Islam put it in the BBC, it's like it's been an attack in the plumbing of, of the pension industry. The way in which it operated has been utterly undermined. And this is creating a crisis, no doubt. At the moment, I'm not aware of the article in the FT that you mentioned about this afternoon, so I can't comment on the detail of that. But I'm certainly aware that a number of pension funds, including for Serco, for example, have said that they're going to have to seek to raise very considerable sums of money in the short term.
Thank you, Roger. As you say, that's a particularly complex area. However, it is something that affects everybody who's got a pension. So it's something that I'm sure we'll come back to again as the market seeks to deal with, as you say, the attack on its very plumbing by the government. Now, there's one more economic aspect I wanted to talk to you about, and then we'll get into the politics, because the slump in the pound is set to exacerbate Britain's energy crisis by boosting the cost of imported natural gas and power. The UK imports much of its energy and fuel, such as gas and coal, which are usually priced in dollars or euros. So heating homes and supplying factories costs more. British power generators also now need to pay more in sterling terms to produce electricity because the imported fuel they burn has gone up in price. It just makes energy more expensive, said Phil Hewitt, a director at Inapsys Limited, an energy data consultancy. That could end up further increasing the cost of the government energy subsidy programmes that are already predicted to cost nearly £200 billion. If wholesale power and gas costs rise further above the programme's price caps, the government, through borrowing or taxes, will be paying a higher bill for the next 2 years, and prices could also rise for households and businesses in the longer term. So, Roger, most people recognise that the way in which the government energy subsidy programmes were structured were in effect writing blank cheques to the energy companies. So does the drop in the value of the pound make it likely that that blank cheque is just getting bigger and bigger?
Yeah, and not just in the energy sector, but your energy sector is a well-chosen example for all the reasons that you have said. The fall in the pound makes anything that has to be imported more expensive. And because you've had a fall in the pound in recent times that has been fairly significant, it means there has been significant rises in the cost of imported goods. That fuels inflation. It can't do anything other than fuel inflation. Now, this is where the overall approach is completely contradictory to what they're doing in terms of investing money to create a cap in the energy costs for households. Because as you may recall, Andrew, they said that by imposing this cap, it will reduce inflation by 5%. Right? Now, it's an easy claim to make because you can never prove whether it has reduced inflation by 5%.
Yep.
But even if that claim is true, to then operate in a way that increases import prices takes inflation in the opposite direction, upwards. So this is what I think what puzzles a lot of people is that the UK government are operating completely contradictory policies.
And that certainly has both spooked and confused the markets in spectacular fashion. Thanks, Roger. Now, let's turn to look at the politics of all of this, if we can. Firstly, the Green Party MP, Caroline Lucas, tweeted this afternoon, "Cancel the Tory conference and recall Parliament for Monday. This is going from bad to worse, and we need our democracy to function, to hold Truss and Kwarteng to account now. Look at the damage in 7 days. And we're meant to wait another 10 days before MPs can question them." So, Roger, is Caroline Lucas right to call for the suspension of the usual party conference season and to recall Parliament urgently?
Yes, I'm pleased to see that she's repeated the call that Ian Blackford made 2 days ago when he called for exactly the same thing. So he was quick off the mark there and has been followed by Nicola Sturgeon pointing out that it would be a good idea to recall Parliament. So many people are calling to recall Parliament. I think it's sensible. I think there is absolutely no chance in the current political environment that Liz Truss is going to want to have to face the Commons. And so I think there is little chance that it's going to be recalled by the government. And therefore, they're going to go unchallenged as much as possible. It's like the example you raised earlier, Andrew, about OBR forecasting. Why are they not releasing that information so that they cannot be challenged? So this is not what democracy is supposed to be about. Democracy is supposed to be about making decisions and then having those scrutinized as much as possible in a public arena called a parliament so that people can understand what's happening, what the criticisms are of government policy. And that's what should be happening. You know, it happens in Scotland. Nobody can say that the Scottish government does not face criticism from its opponents every day of the week, right? Why is the UK government so afraid to face its critics every day of the week? Well, we kind of know the answer.
It's a very good point that you make, however, Roger. Now, you mentioned Ian Blackford, so let's look at him for a moment, because the SNP has called for the Chancellor to resign or be sacked following his shambolic handling of the UK's finances. And the SNP's leader at Westminster, Ian Blackford MP, said it's time for this clueless Chancellor to pack his bags and go. Alongside the Prime Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng has taken a wrecking ball to the UK's finances, leaving millions of families across the UK in deep distress. And now we are being told that despite the OBR publishing their forecast to the UK government, the Treasury will delay the publication until the 23rd of November, which is simply unacceptable. So on the key point that Ian Blackford's making there, Roger, do you think would sacking or removing Kwasi Kwarteng now, would that stabilise markets or make things worse?
Well, I personally would go further than Ian has gone. I think there's got to be a removal of the entire government before it would make a difference. I mean, my worry would be if Kwasi Kwarteng was to go, who would be put in his place? Right? Steve Baker, for example.
Yes.
You're going to get no relief from the insanity if he's replaced by somebody like Steve Baker.
Well,
So now,
that
I mean, they all deserve to be sacked, in my view. Truss
it,
deserves to
it's
be sacked.
it's a very good point that you make, Roger, regarding the talent puddle that is the current Conservative Party in Westminster. But the broader point that you make there, I think, is also important. I certainly thought during the week that it's an important point that Truss and Kwarteng have no mandate from the British people for the hugely destructive actions that they're taking. Nobody voted for this. This was in no manifesto. This has never been considered in a public election. That, and also the apparent ability of the government to avoid all scrutiny, even by the OBR, and especially by Parliament, does this crisis, the way in which the crisis has been created and the way in which it's unfolding, is that yet more evidence that the UK Constitution is simply not fit for purpose?
Absolutely. And I would say not only what they're doing not in a manifesto, but the reverse of it was they claimed, as they always have claimed in the past, the Conservatives, that they're the party of ultimate fiscal responsibility, trying to balance the books and all the rest of it. This has been completely blown out of the water. So the claims in their manifestos that you can trust the economy with the Conservatives has clearly been shown to be not true because of the actions this government is now taking. So it's absolutely the case, as you have clearly stated, Andrew, that they have absolutely no mandate whatsoever for what they're doing. But they seemed undeterred by that fact.
As usual, Roger, as usual. Now then, the UBS wealth management business has said that investors now regard the Tories as a doomsday cult. And it seems that voters probably think that too, if recent polling is accurate. A survey by Electoral Calculus carried out between the 23rd and 27th of September showed that if a snap general election was called now, the SNP would win 51 seats and a net gain of 3. The Electoral Calculus results showed that Labour could pick up 178 seats from the Tories, taking them to 381 in total. The current Tory government has a majority with 365, but would lose 191 MPs in one swoop, according to the poll, leaving them with 174. Lib Dems would return 21 MPs, the Greens 1, and Plaid Cymru 4. In Scotland, the results showed the SNP winning 51% of the vote, Labour 25, the Tories 15, the Lib Dems 6, the Greens 2, and other parties 3%. The poll showed that the SNP would gain 4 seats from Douglas Ross, Alistair Jack, Andrew Bowie, and Jamie Stone, the Lib Dem MP for Caithness and Sutherland. There would also be one loss in Kirkcaldy, where Neil Hanby, who of course is now an Alba MP, was elected on an SNP ticket, but the poll expects that seat would now go to Labour. So, Roger, what's your thoughts on this, on the polling that's been published today? I appreciate it's only one poll, but what do you think it potentially accurately reflects the way in which people will vote?
Well, let me answer a completely different question to start with, and that is your subliminal question to me of what do I think about the situation in Kirkcaldy. I mean, it makes me think I should contemplate coming back, because that was the seat that I won and
Yes.
held between 2015 and 2017. So that would pain me enormously if that is thrown back to a unionist party. But in the wider question, I know a wee bit about polling. You've got to be very careful at taking a poll in the midst of a turbulent event as giving you any long-term understanding of what's likely to happen. The hope is that the level of support for the SNP would continue, but it's not going to continue by us sitting and just saying, oh, that's what's going to happen. There's going to have to be an awful lot of work undertaken on the ground to make sure we retain new support that's coming our way. And I'm particularly keen that we retain support for the basic issue of Scottish independence, of course. So I think it's interesting reading the current polls. but I think we'll have to see a few months worth before we can say this is a final judgment of the people rather than an interim judgment.
Completely, Roger. Thank you. Your sage advice is absolutely timely, and so undoubtedly we'll be commenting on the polling again as we enter what is starting to look like a winter of quite some considerable discontent in as I said earlier, here on Brexit Island. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station and to make new programmes. To everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you. Thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers because that would enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again at 12 noon on Sunday with the next edition of the Full Scottish, so please tune in and join us again then. And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I'd like to give very special thanks to our very special guest, Roger Mullin. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you very much.
I'll leave you with a question to ponder over the weekend. What is the ideology that says that the state should borrow money in order to cut taxes for the rich? Please, have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.